Edmund Thorne cleared the last shovelful of snow from the plank door and crawled into the crawlspace beneath his cabin, where the air sat at a steady temperature that required no fire, no fuel, and no explanation to the frozen men who would have called him crazy 6 months earlier. Above him, 3 feet of cabin floor separated him from a world buried under 12 feet of snow, where temperatures had dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for 11 days straight. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, and if stories about frontier ingenuity move you, hit subscribe because tomorrow's story might just save your life in ways you never expected. The winter of 1867 came early to Montana Territory, and it came with a cruelty that caught even experienced prospectors unprepared. Edmund Thorne had spent 2 seasons working claims alongside Simon Radcliffe, a careful man from Cornwall who understood rock and gold but had never quite adapted to the particular brutality of Rocky Mountain cold. They had neighboring cabins separated by half a mile of pine forest, close enough for occasional company but far enough to respect each other's solitude and claim boundaries. Both men had built their cabins the way everyone built cabins in mining country. They selected reasonably straight logs, notched them at the corners, chinked the gaps with moss and mud, and most importantly, they elevated the structures on stone piers that lifted the floor 18 inches above the ground. This was standard practice, taught by every experienced frontiersman and repeated in every conversation about cabin construction. Elevation prevented ground moisture from rotting the floor. Elevation allowed air circulation underneath. Elevation kept the cabin dry and supposedly warmer by avoiding cold air that settled at ground level. December brought the first serious cold. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for days. Both men burned firewood steadily, keeping small fires going constantly in their crude fireplaces. Edmund noticed how much wood he was consuming and began rationing his supply, letting the fire die at night and rebuilding it each morning. The cabin would drop to near freezing by dawn, but he would survive, and his woodpile would last until spring. On the morning of December 19th, Edmund made his usual trip to check trap lines and found Simon's cabin silent with no smoke rising from the chimney. He called out but received no answer. The door was not barred, which was unusual. Edmund pushed it open and found Simon frozen in his bunk, wrapped in every blanket he owned. The fireplace was cold and full of ash. The woodpile outside the cabin was completely exhausted. Simon had burned through his entire winter supply, trying to keep his elevated cabin warm during the cold snap. The gaps in his floor, the air circulation beneath the structure, the careful elevation that was supposed to protect him had instead created a cabin that bled heat constantly into the frozen air. When the wood ran out, the cabin temperature had dropped within hours to match the exterior cold. Simon had frozen to death inside the shelter he had built to protect himself. Edmund helped other prospectors bury Simon 3 days later in ground, so frozen they had to build fires on the burial spot for 2 days just to soften the earth enough to dig. During the burial, Edmund stood looking at Simon's cabin and realized something that would haunt him for months. The design that everyone used, the elevation that everyone considered essential, had killed his friend as surely as if the cabin had never existed at all. Spring arrived in Montana Territory with the usual mud and meltwater, and Edmund Thorne did something that puzzled every prospector in the district. He stopped mining. While others worked their claims during the brief productive season, Edmund spent his days walking through the mountains, visiting abandoned mine shafts, examining root cellars, and asking questions that made no sense to practical men focused on finding gold. In late April, he descended into an abandoned silver mine that had been worked out 3 years earlier. The entrance was a horizontal tunnel cut into a hillside, extending back into solid rock for approximately 200 feet. Edmund brought candles and spent an entire afternoon in that tunnel, and what he discovered changed everything. The surface temperature that day was 65 degrees. Inside the mine, 40 feet from the entrance and surrounded by solid rock, the temperature was noticeably cooler but remarkably constant. Edmund estimated it at approximately 50 degrees. He returned the next day when surface temperature had dropped to 40 degrees. Inside the mine, the temperature remained 50 degrees. He returned a week later during a warm spell that pushed surface temperatures to 75 degrees. The mine interior was still 50 degrees. The rock surrounding that tunnel held a constant temperature regardless of what happened on the surface. The Earth itself was maintaining a stable temperature that was cool in summer and warm in winter compared to the air above ground. He began examining root cellars that settlers had dug for storing vegetables through winter. Potatoes and turnips stored in root cellars did not freeze even when surface temperatures dropped far below zero, because the earth 3 feet down remained above freezing all winter long. Edmund talked to George Whitefield, who had spent 30 years in the mountains. George explained that mines were always the same temperature deep inside. That was just how mountains worked. When Edmund asked why nobody built cabins to take advantage of this constant earth temperature, George looked at him like he was simple-minded. "Ground is cold," George said with certainty. "Cold air sinks. You build on the ground, you freeze. That is why we elevate cabins." But Edmund had felt the warmth in that mine shaft. He had touched the earth walls of root cellars and felt temperature that would keep a man alive without any fire at all. The other prospectors were wrong. The ground held warmth that never left, a constant temperature provided by the earth itself, deeper than winter could reach. Miles Blackwell started a joke that spread through the mining camp. "Edmund Thorne is planning to live like a badger. Next winter, we will find him in a burrow." Arthur Hayward, who ran the supply station, offered his own warning. "The ground will kill you faster than the air. Cold settles down. Heat rises up. This is nature." Edmund did not argue. He simply continued his observations through May and June, examining every underground space he could find, taking note of temperatures and how the earth held its constant warmth, regardless of surface conditions. By late July, he had made his decision. He would build a cabin that defied every piece of conventional wisdom, and he would trust the earth to keep him alive when winter returned. Late summer of 1868 found Edmund Thorne selecting a site for his new cabin with criteria that made no sense to anyone watching. He chose a spot on a gentle slope with good drainage, which was sensible, but then he began construction in a way that violated every established principle of frontier building. He started by clearing the ground down to bare earth and leveling a rectangular area 14 feet by 12 feet. Then, instead of setting stone piers to elevate his cabin floor above the earth, he began digging downward. Other prospectors who passed by and saw what he was doing stopped to offer advice, then criticism, then outright mockery when Edmund explained what he intended to build. "You are putting your floor on the ground," Miles Blackwell said, stating the obvious problem. "Moisture will rot those boards within 2 years. Every cabin needs elevation for air circulation." Edmund continued digging without arguing. He excavated earth from within his marked rectangle, going down 4 feet, removing approximately 60 cubic yards of soil and rock. The work was backbreaking. He used a pick to loosen compacted earth, a shovel to remove it, and a bucket to haul it up and out of the deepening pit. The pile of excavated earth grew beside the construction site like a small hill. George Whitefield visited on a hot afternoon in August and stood at the edge of the excavation, watching Edmund work at the bottom of what looked like a rectangular grave. "You are building yourself a tomb," George said flatly. "Cold air will settle in that hole and you will freeze faster than if you had no shelter at all." "The earth stays warm," Edmund replied. 50 degrees all winter. I have measured it." "You measured it in a mine shaft surrounded by solid rock," George countered. "This is dirt. Dirt is cold. You are wasting your time." Edmund drove his shovel into the earth and climbed out of the pit. He walked George to the edge and pointed down at the exposed walls. "Feel the earth 4 feet down. It is cool now in summer. Come winter, this same earth will be warmer than the air, warmer than any elevated cabin floor." George shook his head and left without another word. The story spread through the mining camp that Edmund Thorne was digging his own grave and calling it a cabin. Men made jokes about it over evening fires. Some suggested he had gone mad from grief over Simon's death. Others simply wrote him off as another fool who would not survive his first winter alone. Edmund ignored them all. As August turned to September, he completed the excavation. The pit measured 14 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. The walls were not perfectly smooth, but he had cut them as vertical as possible and packed any loose earth firmly. The floor of the pit was level and solid. Now came the critical work. He needed to span this excavated space with floor joists strong enough to support an entire log cabin, and he needed to create walls for his underground chamber that would hold back earth pressure and moisture. He had spent considerable time thinking about this problem. The solution required timber, careful measurement, and construction techniques that no one in the mining camp had attempted. The prospectors thought he was building a grave. Edmund was building something that would prove them catastrophically wrong. Edmund spent 2 weeks selecting and cutting timber for the floor joists that would span his excavated crawlspace. He needed logs that were straight, approximately 8 inches in diameter, and 14 feet long to reach across the width of his excavation with enough extension to rest on undisturbed earth at each end. He rejected dozens of trees before finding 10 that met his requirements. He stripped the bark from each joist and shaped the ends to sit flat and stable. The joists would span the crawlspace every 16 inches, close spacing that would distribute the weight of the cabin above across multiple support points. Most cabins used joists spaced 24 inches apart, but Edmund wanted no risk of structural failure. He positioned the first joist across the excavation, then the second, then the third, measuring carefully to maintain exact spacing. By the time all 10 joists were in place, he had created a framework capable of supporting several tons. He tested each joist by hanging his full weight from the center. None deflected more than half an inch. Over the joists, he laid floor planking. These were thick boards, 3 inches by 12 inches, hewn flat on both sides with a broadaxe. He fitted them tightly together and pegged them to the joists with wooden pins he had whittled during evening hours. The floor was solid enough to support an entire log cabin. More importantly, it was the roof of his crawlspace. With the floor complete, Edmund turned his attention to the crawlspace entrance. He had left one section of earth wall exposed at ground level. He built a facing wall from horizontal planks, each board 12 inches wide and 3 inches thick. The planks were stacked horizontally and pegged to vertical posts he had sunk into the ground at each corner. The horizontal plank wall created a finished face that looked almost like a root cellar entrance. Edmund coated the interior surfaces with boiled pine tar, painting it on thick and letting it soak into the wood grain. The tar would waterproof the planks and prevent rot from ground moisture. He built a door from thick planks braced with cross pieces, hung it on iron hinges he had purchased from Arthur Hayward's supply station, and fitted it with a simple latch that could be operated from inside. The door opened inward into the crawlspace, which meant snow piled against it would not prevent entry from within. Inside the crawlspace, Edmund built a sleeping platform raised 6 inches off the earth floor. He constructed shelves along one wall for food storage. He fashioned brackets to hold clay water jugs. The space was 4 feet high, 12 feet wide, and 14 feet deep. A man could sit upright comfortably and move around freely. The final critical element was ventilation. Edmund drilled 2 holes through the floor planking in opposite corners of the crawlspace. Through these holes, he ran iron pipes that extended upward through the cabin walls he would build above. The pipes were disguised as structural elements and would rise above any snow accumulation, providing constant air exchange without creating obvious openings that would reveal his hidden refuge. The cabin above would appear normal. Beneath it lay his thermal refuge, engineered to provide warmth that required no fire and would remain hidden from anyone who did not know to look for it. Edmund completed the log cabin above his crawlspace in late September of 1868. From the outside, it looked like any other prospector's cabin, perhaps built a bit lower to the ground than most, but otherwise unremarkable. A single door, one small window, a stone chimney, and solid log walls chinked with mud and moss. No one looking at it would suspect that beneath the floor lay a 4-foot-deep chamber designed to keep a man alive without fire. He moved his belongings into the cabin in early October and began his testing. He had purchased a mercury thermometer from Arthur Hayward, an expensive instrument that most prospectors would never waste money on, but Edmund needed precise measurements. On October 15th, with morning air temperature at 45 degrees, he descended into his crawlspace and checked the temperature, 52 degrees. The earth was warmer than the autumn air. He lived normally through October, maintaining a small fire in his cabin fireplace for cooking and evening warmth. The cabin was comfortable. The floor felt solid underfoot. Nothing about the structure suggested anything unusual to the occasional visitor who stopped by. Edmund checked his crawlspace temperature weekly. It remained constant between 50 and 52 degrees as October turned to November and surface temperatures began dropping toward freezing. The first snow came on November 8th, a moderate storm that left 6 inches of accumulation. Wind had piled the snow against the north wall of his cabin, drifting it up to the floor level and completely burying his crawlspace entrance. Edmund waited 2 days, then took a shovel and dug down through the drift until he exposed the plank door. He opened it and crawled inside. The temperature was 51 degrees. Outside, the air was 22 degrees. He began checking the crawlspace after every snowfall. Each time, he had to dig through accumulated snow to reach the door. Each time, the temperature inside remained steady around 50 degrees, while exterior temperatures varied from 15 degrees to 35 degrees. The physics he had observed in the mineshaft were proving accurate in his excavated refuge. The earth held its warmth regardless of what happened on the surface. By late November, Edmund was checking his crawlspace daily, not because he needed to, but because he was fascinated by the consistency. The temperature never dropped below 49 degrees and never rose above 53 degrees. It was as stable as any structure he had ever experienced. On December 1st, Nathaniel Perry stopped by and found Edmund digging at the base of his cabin wall. "What are you doing down there?" Nathaniel asked. "Checking the foundation," Edmund replied, which was technically true. "In the snow?" "Making sure everything settled properly." Edmund kept his explanation vague. He was not ready to reveal his crawlspace. The real test was still coming. He needed winter cold, the kind of cold that had killed Simon, before he would know if his engineering actually worked. Nathaniel shrugged and rode on. Edmund closed the crawlspace door and covered it with snow. December was coming, and with it, the cold that would validate everything or prove the prospectors right. He would not have to wait long. December of 1868 arrived with temperatures that dropped faster and harder than anyone in the mining district had anticipated. On December 7th, the morning temperature was 5 degrees above zero. By December 10th, it had fallen to 15 below. By December 13th, it reached 25 below zero and showed no sign of moderating. Edmund watched his fellow prospectors react with increasing concern. Men who had been casually burning firewood suddenly began rationing their supplies. Arthur Hayward's supply station saw a run on firewood, with prospectors paying premium prices for split logs they should have prepared during summer. Arthur warned anyone who would listen that at current consumption rates, most cabins would run out of fuel before spring. Miles Blackwell stopped by Edmund's cabin on December 14th and found the fireplace burning normally. "You keeping warm enough?" Miles asked. "Well enough," Edmund replied. "This cold is worse than last year. I am going through twice the firewood I planned." After Miles left, Edmund made his decision. He let his cabin fire die completely. He moved his bedding down into the crawlspace along with food supplies, his thermometer, candles, and a book. Then he crawled into his refuge. The crawlspace temperature read 49 degrees. Outside, the air was 25 below zero. The difference was 74 degrees, maintained by nothing but earth and snow insulation. Edmund spread his bedding on the wooden sleeping platform and settled in. The first night was an adjustment. 49 degrees was cool but not cold. With wool blankets and his heavy coat, Edmund slept comfortably. The air was still and slightly damp but not unpleasant. He woke feeling rested. The thermometer still read 49 degrees. He spent 3 days living in the crawlspace. He ate cold food that never froze. He read by candlelight. He slept under blankets. The temperature never varied. On the third day, he heard someone calling his name and emerged to find Miles Blackwell looking alarmed. "Edmund! Thank God! I thought you were dead. There has been no smoke from your chimney for 3 days." Edmund brushed snow from his coat. "I am not dead. But how?" "Come with me." Edmund led Miles to the base of the cabin wall and dug down through the snowdrift until he exposed the plank door. He opened it. "Feel the air." Miles knelt and put his hand into the crawlspace entrance. His expression changed to disbelief. "It is warm. 49 degrees. It has been 49 degrees for 3 days with no fire. The earth stays warm." Miles crawled partway into the space and touched the earth walls. He stayed there for a long moment, then backed out slowly. He stood and looked at Edmund with an expression that was no longer mocking. "You have been living under your cabin. The earth provides warmth that never changes. I do not need firewood to survive winter." Edmund closed the crawlspace door and began covering it with snow. Miles watched in silence, then walked to his horse without another word. He did not tell anyone what he had seen. He was not sure anyone would believe it, but he knew what he had felt. Warmth from the earth itself, constant and reliable, requiring nothing but the wisdom to dig deep enough to reach it. January of 1869 brought weather that would be remembered across Montana Territory for decades. The storm system moved in on January 4th with snowfall that did not stop for 6 consecutive days. By January 9th, 8 feet of snow had accumulated. By January 12th, it was 10 feet. By January 15th, drifts measured 12 to 15 feet where wind had piled snow against structures. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero on January 16th and stayed there. The mining camp was buried. Cabins disappeared under snow up to their roof lines. Chimneys that had been 6 feet tall were reduced to small holes barely visible above the white surface. Men who ventured outside struggled through snow that was waist-deep in packed areas and chest-deep where drifts had formed. Arthur Hayward's supply station became the emergency gathering point. The news was grim. Lawrence Garrett had been found frozen in his elevated cabin on January 18th. His firewood supply had been exhausted days earlier. When neighbors dug through to his door, they found him wrapped in blankets, dead from exposure. George Whitfield nearly died on January 20th when smoke from his block chimney backed up into his cabin. He had been burning firewood desperately, but snow accumulation had covered his chimney opening. Carbon monoxide filled his cabin while he slept. He woke feeling sick, realized what was happening, and managed to break through his door before losing consciousness. Nathaniel Perry found him half buried in snow and dragged him to safety. The mining camp was in crisis. 3 men were confirmed dead. 7 others had severe frostbite. Firewood supplies were critically low. The storm had stopped, but temperatures remained at 40 below zero. Every cabin was buried to roof level. Every chimney required constant digging. Every hour required firewood that no one could afford to burn. Edmund Thorne had entered his crawlspace on January 14th with 2 weeks of food supplies. He sealed the door and descended into earth that maintained its steady warmth regardless of the catastrophe unfolding above. The crawlspace temperature held at 48 degrees throughout the whiteout. He slept comfortably under wool blankets. He ate cold food that never froze. He read by candlelight. He listened to wind howling and felt nothing but stable warmth provided by earth that had been holding this temperature since before men arrived in these mountains. On the surface, temperatures remained at 35 to 40 below zero for 11 consecutive days. Snow depth made movement nearly impossible. Chimneys blocked repeatedly. Firewood supplies dwindled toward nothing. Men burned furniture and floorboards to stay alive. The world above ground had become genuinely uninhabitable. 4 feet below that surface, Edmund lived in conditions that required no fuel, produced no smoke, and maintained temperatures that would keep a man alive indefinitely as long as food lasted. The earth did not care about blizzards. The earth simply held its warmth, ancient and patient and reliable. On January 27th, The temperature finally began to rise. Edmund heard the change in wind patterns and knew the crisis was passing. He had survived 13 days underground, without seeing daylight, without burning firewood, without hardship beyond boredom. He checked his thermometer. 48 degrees, exactly what it had been when he entered. He gathered his blankets and prepared to dig back to the surface. Edmund began, digging upward on the morning of January 28th. The snow above his crawlspace entrance had compacted under its own weight into a dense layer that required steady work with a shovel. He dug for 2 hours, creating a tunnel through 4 feet of packed snow before breaking through to open air and blinding sunlight. The surface world looked unrecognizable. Snow covered everything to depths that transformed the landscape into rolling white dunes. Cabins were buried to their eaves. Only chimney tops and roof peaks indicated where structures existed. The temperature had risen to 10 below zero, which felt almost warm after weeks of extreme cold. Edmund climbed out of his snow tunnel and made his way toward Arthur Hayward's supply station, the only structure large enough to remain partially visible above the snow. Inside, he found a gathering of haggard survivors. Faces were gaunt from stress and limited food. Several men showed blackened fingers from frostbite. The mood was grim. Arthur looked up as Edmund entered, and his expression shifted from surprise to confusion. "Edmund? We thought you were dead. Your cabin showed no smoke for 2 weeks." "I am not dead," Edmund said simply. "But how did you survive?" "Everyone has been burning everything they own just to stay alive." Nathaniel Perry, who was wrapped in blankets near the stove, nursing frostbitten hands, spoke up. "I burned my furniture. My table, my chairs, even my door frame. I had 3 pieces of firewood left when the temperature finally broke." George Whitfield added, "I nearly died from smoke when my chimney blocked." Lawrence Garrett froze to death. 3 others are dead, and you show up looking like you just took a pleasant walk." "How?" Edmund explained about the crawlspace. He described the excavation beneath his cabin floor, the earth temperature that remained constant at 48 degrees, the physics of thermal mass below the frost line. He told them he had spent 13 days underground without any fire, surviving comfortably on the Earth's warmth while the surface world became uninhabitable. The prospectors listened in silence. Some looked skeptical, others looked angry, as if Edmund had cheated by discovering something they should have known. George Whitfield finally spoke. "You survived 2 weeks at 48 degrees with no fire? The Earth below the frost line maintains constant temperature year-round. I measured it last spring, in mine shafts and root cellars. I built my cabin to access that warmth. It worked exactly as I calculated." "I called you a fool last summer," George said quietly. "I told you that you were building a grave." "You were wrong," Edmund replied without malice. Ground-level construction with excavation beneath provides better thermal protection than any elevated cabin. The earth gives warmth that never fails as long as you dig deep enough to reach it. Nathaniel Perry looked at his frostbitten hands and then at Edmund. "Show me how to build one. Before next winter, I want a crawlspace under my cabin." Edmund nodded. "I will help you dig it." The shift in the room was palpable. The mockery was gone. The skepticism was replaced by genuine interest born from men who had nearly died and now understood that Edmund's impossible idea had been correct all along. Spring of 1869 arrived late, with snow persisting into April and ground remaining frozen until May. When the earth finally thawed enough to work, Edmund Thorne found himself teaching crawlspace construction to prospectors who had mocked him less than a year earlier. Nathaniel Perry was the first. His elevated cabin had survived the winter structurally, but Nathaniel had no intention of repeating the experience of burning his furniture to stay alive. In late May, Edmund helped him begin excavation adjacent to the existing cabin rather than attempting to dig underneath the already constructed floor. The modification presented challenges. They dug a chamber 4 feet deep beside the cabin's north wall, then carefully broke through the log wall to create a connecting passage. The technique worked, though it was more labor-intensive than building the crawlspace during initial construction. Nathaniel's refuge was smaller than Edmund's, only 8 feet by 10 feet, but it provided the same access to stable Earth temperature. By mid-June, 4 more prospectors had approached Edmund requesting guidance. Miles Blackwell wanted a crawlspace. George Whitfield, who had called Edmund a fool, now asked detailed questions about excavation techniques and ventilation design. 2 younger prospectors who had arrived after the winter asked to be shown the proper method before building their first cabins. Edmund shared his knowledge freely. He explained the importance of digging to at least 4 feet depth to reach below the frost line. He demonstrated proper shoring techniques to prevent wall collapse during excavation. He showed them how to waterproof plank-facing walls with pine tar and how to construct doors that opened inward to prevent snow blockage. Arthur Hayward, recognizing the practical value, built a large crawlspace beneath his supply station. His version was 8 feet deep and 20 feet long, designed to serve as emergency shelter for multiple people during extreme weather. Arthur installed a heavy door with a proper lock and stocked the space with emergency food supplies and blankets. The summer building season saw a fundamental shift in mining camp construction philosophy. New cabins were built at ground level rather than elevated. Excavation became a standard part of the building process rather than an eccentric choice. The prospectors developed variations on Edmund's basic design. Some built deeper chambers reaching 5 feet below surface. Others incorporated root cellar features with separate storage sections for food preservation. Winter of 1869 to 1870 tested the new constructions. 12 crawlspaces were operational across the mining district. The winter was harsh but not as catastrophic as the previous year. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero for extended periods. Snow accumulation reached 6 feet. But this time, prospectors had refuges that required no firewood to maintain livable temperatures. 0 deaths from cold exposure occurred that winter. Firewood consumption across the camp dropped by an estimated 60%. Men who had been terrified of winter now faced it with confidence born from understanding basic physics. The earth stayed warm. A man who could access that warmth could survive anything the Montana winter offered. The technique spread beyond the immediate mining district through travelers and supply wagons. By spring of 1870, prospectors in camps 50 miles away were digging crawlspaces and calling them warm cellars or thorn holes, names that stuck even as the innovation became standard practice rather than novelty. The late 1870s found Edmund Thorne still working his claim in Montana Territory, now part of a mining camp that had grown from a scattered collection of desperate prospectors to a stable community of men who understood how to survive winter. The crawlspace had become an expected feature of frontier construction, as common as chimneys and as necessary as doors. New arrivals from California and Colorado expressed surprise that every cabin in the district was built at ground level with excavated chambers beneath. That is how it is done in Montana, the old-timers would explain. Earth stays warm below the frost line. A man builds smart, or he does not survive. Most newcomers did not know the origin of the technique. Edmund had never promoted his innovation or sought recognition. He had simply shared what he learned freely with anyone who asked. The crawlspace spread through practical demonstration and word of mouth, becoming part of regional building knowledge without attribution. Occasionally, old-timers like George Whitfield or Nathaniel Perry would point out that Edmund had figured it first back in '68. But even this acknowledgement faded as years passed and new prospectors arrived who had never known any other building method. Geological surveys conducted in the late 1870s confirmed what Edmund had discovered through observation. Earth temperature below the frost line remained constant year-round at approximately 48 to 52 degrees regardless of surface conditions. The scientific explanation validated what frontier builders had already proven through practical application. Mining camp records from the period, fragmentary as they were, suggested that dozens of lives had been saved by crawlspace survival during extreme cold snaps in the decade following Edmund's original construction. Men who would have frozen when firewood ran out instead retreated to earth, warmed refuges, and survived comfortably until weather moderated. Edmund continued mining until 1882 with modest success. He never struck a major claim, but he made enough to live comfortably and save money for eventual retirement. In the spring of 1882, he left Montana for Oregon Territory to join his brother's timber operation near Portland. He married in 1884, raised 2 children, and lived quietly as a timber mill supervisor until his death in 1891 at age 59 from pneumonia. He was buried in a Portland cemetery under a simple granite marker that listed his name, birth, and death dates, and nothing else. No mention was made of his mining years or the innovation that had saved lives across the northern Rockies. The crawlspaces remained. Abandoned mining camps throughout Montana contained ground-level cabins with excavated chambers beneath. Modern archaeologists who discovered these structures initially puzzled over their purpose, confused by construction that violated conventional wisdom about elevation and drainage. Eventually, the historical record revealed them as sophisticated thermal management systems developed by men who learned to trust physics over tradition. The techniques spread, saved lives, and faded into obscurity, along with the man who first proved that the warmest place in winter was not where fire burned, but where earth remembered summer. Silent structures buried under decades of soil and forest growth, testament to engineering born from tragedy and validated by survival. Edmund Thorne's legacy, unmarked and largely forgotten, but real in every life his impossible idea had saved.